we, thine unworthy servants here gathered together in thy name, do most humbly beseech thee to send down thy heavenly wisdom from above, to direct and guide us in all our consultations. And grant that, we having thy fear always before our eyes, and laying aside all private interests, prejudices, and partial affections, the result of all our counsels may be to the glory of thy blessed name, the maintenance of true religion and justice, the safety, honor, and happiness of the Queen, the public weal, peace and tranquility of the island, and the uniting and knitting together of the hearts of all persons and estate within the same, in true Christian love and charity, one towards another, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Be seated, please.
Mr. Colonel Charles Jr., Mr. Whittle, Mr. Samuda, Mr. Holness, Dr. Clarke, Mr. Shaw, Dr. Chan, Mr. Montague, Ms. Grange, Mr. Henry, Mr. Bartlett, Mr. Mackenzie, Mr. Chuck, Mr. Vaz, Mr. Daryl Vaz, Mr. Warmington, Mr. Hutchinson, Dr. Tufton, Mrs. Williams, Mr. Campbell, Mrs. Malahoo Ford, Mr. Green, Mr. Terry Long, Mr. Main, Mr. R. Scott, Mr. Richard Azan, Mr. R. Scott, Mr. Brown, Dr. Brownberg, Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Bunting, Dr. Campbell, Mr. Purnell Charles, Mr. Clarke, Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn, Ms. Daly, Mr. Daly, Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Dr. Dunn, Mr. Fagan, Dr. Ferguson, Mr. Colding, Dr. Guy, Ms. Hannah, Mr. Hales, Mrs. Holness, Mr. Hilton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Kellier, Dr. McNeil, Ms. Nita, Mr. Paulwell, Mr. Michael Phillips, Dr. Phillips, Mr. Pickersgill, Mr. Redmond, Mr. James Robertson, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Stewart, Reverend Thwaites, Mrs. Vaz, Mr. Dwayne Vaz, Dr. Wheatley, Mr. Wright, Dr. Wheatley, sir. Ms. Daly,
Statements by ministers.
Mr. Speaker, today a statement will be made by the Honourable Prime Minister at a later stage during the proceedings. Also, a statement by the Minister of Finance and the Public Service. And I will make a very brief statement. I've already sent the copy to the opposition, leader of opposition business. And then, of course, Mr. Speaker, at notices of motion given orally, I will take the matter standing in the Prime Minister's name on his behalf. At statement by ministers, I would like to start briefly with my statement, and then the Minister of Local Government will make a statement. And at the completion of the matters pertaining to the zones of special operations, we will terminate our proceedings for the day. So, with your leave, Mr. Speaker, I would just proceed to make a very brief statement. If I could just have the lectern. Thank you very much.
Mr. Samuel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as we prepare for the new school year during this time of crisis, it is extremely important that all stakeholders work collaboratively with the best interests of our students in mind. The exorbitant fees being requested by some schools are untenable, and school administrators are encouraged not to pursue any increase in these fees for the 2020-2021 academic year. I would like to take this opportunity to remind the school administrators of the non-mandatory fee policy for instant primary and secondary education institutions. Mr. Speaker, the Ministry's philosophy is that public education should be properly funded by government while encouraging stakeholders to make voluntary contributions. In other words, we have no objection to anyone making a voluntary contribution to assist in the running of the schools, but at the same time, there are certain limits beyond which we are encouraging them not to go. The Ministry of Education, Youth and Information will continue to fund schools through the provision of grants to be distributed in 4 tranches: April, June, September, and December, in keeping with our long-term goals of ensuring equity, access for all, and the provision of quality education. Mr. Speaker, the parent contribution charges should be reasonable and reflect consideration for the challenges of our parents who are facing all of these difficulties during the disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Speaker, students should not be denied entry to schools because their parents are unable to pay. Parents should not be forced to pay any contribution or made to feel as if they must pay the contribution as a requirement for registration, school access and attendance, or criteria for graduation, examination slips, application of sixth form, and or access to any public service at a public educational institution. Registration packages for students should be no more than $5,000 for this school year and should outline what the package entails to justify the need for the fees. Items that attract a cost, such as IDs, insurance, PE, uniforms, and school ties, should not be included in the registration package. These should be itemized for purchase separately. Mr. Speaker, where there is need for further clarity concerning this matter, school administrators and other stakeholders should not hesitate to contact their regional directors. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Bunting.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what the Minister has stated there, or the Minister's statement really is just a restatement of the policy that normally applies to schools from the Ministry of Education. And Mr. Speaker, given that we are facing perhaps the most severe challenge to our education system, and we risk compromising the career chances of our children because of the learning loss that will be taking place during the lockdown or partial lockdown periods of this pandemic. I had really expected something much more dramatic, something more appropriate for the situation that we face. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I would expect, and the opposition is calling for, the government to examine a special COVID allocation to recognize the challenges, that parents are facing. An allocation of at least $10,000 per student. That allocation would deal with things like the increased need for access to the internet. And for many parents, the only access they have is to buy data. So this should be something that the government should be looking at to deal with this phased and blended approach to reopening the school system. Mr. Speaker, many of our parents will have to be providing home care for students, particularly younger students who can't be left on their own. And this would help offset some of the costs, either to have a caregiver employed to oversee the children, or to help compensate that parent for having to stay at home and therefore give up the opportunity to earn an income. Mr. Speaker, that could be means tested. So we may not need to give it 100%, but we know that the vast majority of our parents are in need of that support. Mr. Speaker, the Minister announced a couple of weeks ago that primary schools would be getting $500,000 per school special support to prepare for back to school. What he omitted to say that 150 of that 500,000 was the normal maintenance allowance that schools would get. So when you have a school like Mandeville Primary with going towards 1,500 to 2,000 students, and you give them $350,000 as a special allocation, it is really a drop in the bucket. We really need a per student allocation that will go to parents to help them to deal with the additional preparation. And Mr. Speaker, just a few weeks away from the start of the school term, and still nothing for basic schools. Nothing for basic schools. We have agreed in this house, all of us, that the early childhood is the most critical period. The most critical period. And yet we have heard absolutely nothing for the basic schools and the 100,000 or so children who are in the early childhood sector. Mr. Speaker, this applies as well to the private schools. We have made we've used on multiple occasions both in this House and on other platforms to advocate for some assistance for private schools, even to help pay some of the teachers. Because if students don't have access to these private school spaces, the government will still have an obligation to provide for them in the public system, but will have to build additional infrastructure, and we don't have that capacity in the short term. So, Mr. Speaker, I am closing by saying to the Minister, I am disappointed. All he has done here is restate what the policy that has been in existence for a number of years. And on behalf of the opposition, we're calling for the government to look at a $10,000 per student special COVID allocation to come into play to support parents for the next school year.
Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Mr. Stewart, you have a question?
Yes, one question here, Mr. Speaker.
Go ahead.
Mr. Minister, we note, for example, yesterday in the United States of America that 95,000 students were tested positive for COVID-19. We note, for example, that the schools will have to get their masks. Will you be assisting the ministry, assisting the students, the schools to procure masks for the students, because that is something that they need to have with schools coming up soon?
Mr. Shemudo.
Said in this honorable House before, and I keep reiterating it. My friend, the leader of opposition business, whenever he speaks, I get a sense that I'm in an echo chamber, because it's a good strategy that if you hear of what is to come, you say it first and say you have followed my lead. It's a good strategy. So what I do to ensure that it is brought out, I give him a teaser, throw out a bait, and he grab it. He's so anxious to grab the bait that he leaves himself the possibility of being embarrassed for even making the suggestion. You don't understand what I'm talking about. You have your own set of problems. You don't understand what I'm talking about. So, Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is he misinterpreted my statement to suggest that I was giving a solution to the challenges facing children going back to school. Nothing could be further from the truth. This statement addresses one element of challenges facing the parents to underwrite the cost of auxiliary fees. One, the Minister of Finance will be making a fulsome statement on the question of support for children and parents, extensive report on the recommendations, on the decisions taken to support the back-to-school effort. An extensive statement. So because we are a government that unites in our effort in every single aspect of the word, he will be piloting that effort today, not me. I simply took out this particular one, which is of importance. So whilst your suggestions are worthy suggestions, you preempted the Minister of Finance, who will be giving a fulsome explanation of what our strategies are. We are a party and a government that thinks of all the factors that affect the children of Jamaica. Well, in our business, we are very careful to give the person with the responsibility for the money. We don't make empty promises. When he delivers as Minister of Finance, that is a fact. We're not like you who go out and speculate.
Order, please. Order, please.
No, hold on. You stick with your script as little as it offers. You stick with it. Don't go into things that will make you drown. In respect of the masks, rest assured, which is really logical, you would assume, and I know you have observed the level of intelligence that operates in front of you. You would assume that that's not him starting at A. That is naturally what will be done. All students will be supplied with masks that will serve them throughout the pandemic, without question. So, Mr. Speaker, I invite you now.
Mr. Speaker, I have a question for the Minister.
All right.
Sir, Mr. Speaker. No, not yet. Mr. Speaker, the Minister who has responsibility for schools.
You're standing, sir.
Yes,
Point
Mr.
of order.
No, not a point of order. That's a thing for the question for the Minister. Because he said the Ministry's thought about everything. I just want to know, Minister, that with the pending elections, most schools will be used as election centers. Are there provisions for deep cleaning of the facilities? Having called the election in the middle of the school, back-to-school period. What provisions are made for the sanitation of the facilities after the use by the voters?
If you had asked me what provisions are made for the school after the refresher involvement with the students going in before school officially opens, and during the term when the children will be in the school, I'd be in a far better position to answer that. If you ask me about what is going to happen after the election is held, I'm afraid you'd have to. We will deal with it at the school level, but as far as the election, I'm not the one that have anything to do with that. My job is to deal with children in school. Ask the Prime Minister that. That's his prerogative. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to invite you to ask the Minister of Local Government if he would make his statement at this time. Minister of Local Government and Community Development.
Mr. Mackenzie, Minister.
To the propositions, spokesman, and one to the Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in July, I announced the easing of restrictions for the gradual return of the
entertainment sector. That came in effect on the 21st of July. It was made clear then that we were expecting all the necessary systems outlined by the Ministry of Health to be observed in the reopening of the sector. I'm very disappointed that after all the consultations that we have had with the stakeholders in the entertainment sector, and the fact that we spent a lot of time involving the public in the general discussions around COVID-19, we observe, Mr. Speaker, severe deficiencies in the response by persons within the industry. We note where events took place without the requisite permits being sought, and we also observe the blatant disregard by promoters. Accordingly, after discussions with the players in the entertainment sector and other stakeholders, since that time and up to this week, Mr. Speaker, I am today announcing some revised measures to govern the hosting of small outdoor events. This is intended, Mr. Speaker, to bring some level of order to the sector. I must make the point that the government has created the opportunity for the sector to strive, but as we know, Mr. Speaker, there are many persons who have failed to observe the necessary restrictions that have been placed. All of these measures that I'm going to be announcing shortly, Mr. Speaker, came out of extensive discussions with the sector. Yesterday, we met for about 4 hours to come to a position that will allow the entertainment sector to continue to operate, but under more control measures, putting in many of what they put on the table. As of the 24th of August, Mr. Speaker, small outdoor events, parties, tailgate parties, round robins, launches and festival with the necessary permits will be allowed to operate on specific days. And the days are Thursdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays between the hours of 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. Applications for permits must be made to the municipal corporation at least 15 days before the date of the event. A committee will be established at each municipal corporation to receive and review all applications. This committee will consist of members of the municipal corporation, the Jamaica Constabulary Force, the Jamaica Fire Brigade, and the Ministry of Health, Mr. Speaker, because it is important that in the protocols, the health component of this is observed. A copy of the permit that has been granted for the staging of the event must be displayed
at the entrance of this facility at least 8 hours before the event, Mr. Speaker. And one of the problems we are having, and in the work of the police, it is discovered that many events are taking place without the requisite permits. And persons are running the risk, Mr. Speaker, by turning up at these events, enjoying themselves, not knowing that they are in breach because there's no permit to host these events, Mr. Speaker. And this is one of the decisions that came out. All events, Mr. Speaker, the promotion of events where the promoters have agreed to ensure that the COVID-19 protocols are displayed in the advertising of events. And what that means, Mr. Speaker, is that all the necessary wearing of masks and the sanitization protocol must be a part of the promotion of the event. So apart from giving the name of the event and the date and the location, we have agreed that that information must be on the flyer so the public knows that you must come prepared to get sanitized, wear your mask. This is a part of an effort to keep the business open, Mr. Speaker. The question of the observing the protocols of the social distancing and the temperature check, Mr. Speaker, is a part of the agreement with the sector. Changes will be made to the number of persons that will be allowed to attend these events, Mr. Speaker. Previously, we had agreed on a number of 280, which 250 would be persons coming to enjoy themselves, and the other 30 would be persons selling in the bar and the musicians. Arising out of discussions with the sector, we have agreed to reduce this number down to 230, which will have 200 patrons and 30 being performers and members of staff for the events that are taking place. One of the agreements coming out of the meeting is that there should be a public service announcement every 15 minutes. The DJ will use his microphone to remind the audience about the protocols, wearing of the mask, observing, and reminding persons that at all times you must wear your mask. If you're eating or you're drinking, then we understand. But it is important, Mr. Speaker, based on what we have seen so far, that these measures be observed. The Ministry of Local Government, along with the Ministry of Health and the police, and the various entities will be monitoring, Mr. Speaker, the events taking place. One of the major suggestions that was put on the table by the promoters, the sound system operators, and those that are present, because they themselves are concerned about the breaches that have been taking place. And they have put on the table that any person, venue, sound system operator that is found in breach of any of the protocols, they have put on the table that these persons must be banned for a period of 6 months from obtaining any permit to carry out any form of entertainment, Mr. Speaker. That suggestion came from them, and we, Mr. Speaker, have agreed. to put it, Mr. Speaker. Because, Mr. Speaker, the public has a responsibility to ensure that these events that they are going is properly structured, Mr. Speaker, and all the necessary safety nets are put in place. One area of concern, Mr. Speaker, that is worrying the government and the country is what is taking place at our beaches and rivers across the island, Mr. Speaker. The level of indiscipline amongst persons who are attending these locations have made it necessary for some strong actions to be taken in regards to the operation of 17 beaches and 19 rivers across the country, which would come the 14th of August, Mr. Speaker, we will be closing the following beaches: in Kingston and St. Andrew, Bob Marley, St. Catherine Elshaw, Clarendon, Folkestone Beach, Manchester, Alligator Pond, St. Elizabeth, Great Bay Beach, Westmoreland, Bluefields Beach, Norman Manley Beach, Trelawney, Burwood, Jacob Taylor, Half Moon Bay, Victoria Charlotte Beach in Trelawney, St. Anne, Ocherous Beach, Turtle Tower Beach, Fantasy Beach, Cardiff Hall Beach, Flavor Beach in Portland, Winifred Beach, Frenchman's Cove, and Boston Beach. Rivers, Mr. Speaker, again, is of real concern, Mr. Speaker. And I want to speak about a particular location in St. Mary, Spanish Bridge River, Mr. Speaker, between the border of St. Anne and St. Mary, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, some of what takes place at the Spanish Bridge River cannot allow to continue, Mr. Speaker. And we are closing the following rivers in the parish of Kingston and St. Andrew: Cane River, Penfield River, Grove River, Cane River, Hope River. In St. Catherine, Caymanas River and Natural Paradise River. Clarendon, we're going to close it, police it. Yeah, we're closing the facility. The facility. Salt River, Cockpit. In Manchester, Alligator Pond, Noisy River, Oxford River, Butters River, yes, Westmoreland, Sweet River, St. Anne, Little Duns River, and I said Spanish River and Blue Hole River in Cascade in St. Mary, Yallas River, Reggae Falls, Roaring River. This is a total of 19 rivers and 17 beaches, Mr. Speaker, which will be closed for a period of 2 weeks. We have invited previously before the operators of these facilities to come in to engage in discussions how to regularize and to put the necessary infrastructure in place for the smooth operation of these facilities. We are going to be doing that again, Mr. Speaker, inviting these people to come in. We have to be a responsible government to put the interests of the Jamaican people first, Mr. Speaker, and we believe that these measures are necessary because we are not getting the kind of response from the operators and the public in general for the use of these facilities. So, Mr. Speaker, on that note, I would encourage persons to ensure that they are in line with the new measures that we have put in, not to cripple the industry, but to put in some safeguards, some measures at this time, because the Ministry of Health has raised some serious concerns, and we'll be working closely with the police and the team to monitor and to ensure that we have the necessary compliance as best as possible, Mr. Speaker. I thank you.
Mr. Speaker, while I agree wholeheartedly with Minister and endorse his emphasis on our citizens being more responsible, it is important that we put in place the necessary structures to monitor and regulate the protocols that are in place. The truth is, there isn't any government which is going to be able to monitor 100% of the movement of its citizens. And as such, I re-emphasize the importance of individual citizens recognizing their responsibility to themselves and to their fellow citizens. There is nothing that removes that responsibility from you. Even when you know the rules, you flaunt them at the detriment of our citizens and to yourselves. I am, however, concerned that the monitoring process will cause for the very protocols we put in place not to be properly observed. And this could be so because we don't have sufficient staffing in many instances to be able to carefully monitor. And I speak to what obtains at the airports. When people come in, they go through the airports, and a lot of them, tested or untested, go about their business, and you can't quarantine them, and some personal responsibility has to be exercised. And persons coming in, and they're not being monitored, and they're not downloading the thing on their app, and nobody can follow them, and that kind of monitoring process fails us, because if someone goes back to the States after 3 weeks of being in Jamaica, and it is when they are there, they get a text to say you can now, you are free to go from quarantine after they have returned to their homes in the States. So the monitoring process has to be structured in such a way that we are able to handle, based on what we are expecting, a matching structure which is able to put the kind of monitoring in the process. So if we are expecting that there are going to be 500 events this weekend, we must have personnel available for those 500 events. Exactly. If not, we are wasting our time to just putting the protocols in place. And while I say it again and I reemphasize, every citizen has a responsibility, a personal responsibility, to take care of himself and his fellow citizens. We have a responsibility as a government to put the systems in place that allow for us to be sufficiently convinced that our people are going to be safe. I'm also concerned, Minister, that ordinary Jamaicans who apply for permits at our local municipal corporations apply having planned for some time, invested in goat, invest in liquor, invest in all sorts of things. Apply within reasonable time based on what we set out as the protocol. Yet they are not responded to within a particular period of time. So I apply for our round robin, and there's no timely response after I've applied for a month to have my round robin in a month. And the day before my event is when I'm told that I can't have the event. That does not allow for anybody to plan adequately and to be able to utilize this very source of income that is going to be able to send their children to school and take care of their families. So while we protect all of us in this process, let's protect the economic lives of our citizens who are depending on us as representatives to put the systems in place to allow for them to, one, take care of themselves and their families, health, but to also be able to plan and earn an income. Because if COVID don't catch you, sufferation will. So we have to put the systems in place. Thank you.
One question, Minister. Just one question, read the amount of persons that you have changed it from now to 230. I was wondering, isn't the size of the venue what we should use to determine how many persons can come in? So some venues wouldn't be able to accommodate 200 based on the size, while some can accommodate 1,000. So why don't we do it based on the square footage of the venue to determine how many persons should be allowed to come to the event?
In response to your question, that's why the word small outdoor events and the square footage also takes into consideration the amount of persons. And it is you arrive at that following the inspection that is done. And we want to minimize as much as possible the number of persons attending events. That is why the word small was used, but taking into consideration the size of the location. Okay? So the square footage also becomes important in doing the assessment, if it answers your questions. Right. Now, in response to the members, the point the member raised, let me start first of all with the question of the permit. That has been a burning issue long before COVID, where persons have raised these concerns about the period of time that it takes for the permit to be vetted, and once they get it from the MC, they go to the police, then a day before or 2 days or sometimes the same day, you get a response from the police. The police has been at the table in this discussion. That is why we have moved the period from 10 days to 15 days to give the grouping time to look at the various application that comes in. And once that is done, within that 15-day period, the person who has applied for the permit will, within that 15 days, get the response as to whether or not the event can be held. One of the considerations in the discussions, which the promoters themselves admitted to, that there are areas where the security forces are concerned about level of violence and the challenge that they would have in terms of controlling. And that is why some areas get a greater challenge in terms of the response. So the reason why we have opted for the 15 days and also for the 4 nights is to allow the security forces, because you can't have our policemen Monday to Monday monitoring parties and monitoring rivers and beaches. So it is a strain on the security forces, and that is why we have agreed on a 4-day holding of parties starting from the 24th. But persons who have already have their permits for events would be allowed to continue, but the new measures would come in on the 24th. You raise a question about monitoring. There are going to be some 2,000 young people, which is presently on the road now, working through the SDC and the municipal corporations and the Ministry of Health in monitoring activities across the country. And once these young people, and this is how we have been able to capture some of the information on the rivers and the beaches, where we can give you specific numbers on days where, for instance, if you go to Elshire, they had 850 persons, one location of over 2,000 persons. So that is why we were able to be specific, because of that level of monitoring. Right, yes, and that is why they have been able. That is how we found out that over 700 parties were taking place without any permits at all. So we do have a team of people out there monitoring, and we hope to retain some of them and also have them trained by the Ministry of Health to work as a part of that protocol that goes around the country to do the necessary surveillance. So we do have a set of young people under the Youth Summer Employment Program that is presently working through the various municipal corporations across the island to obtain the data and to do the monitoring.
The truth is, when someone advertises a party, you advertise not knowing how many people will turn up, right? So I advertise a little beach get-together. Once I put it on Instagram or I put it on Facebook, 500 people turn up, right? There's no monitor there, so the person at the gate is not advised that when you reach 250, everybody else needs to go home, right? And that's the difficulty you have, because it's not that anyone is telling everybody to come in thousands, right? So the wardens you have, perhaps if we expand the number of wardens to match the event application process. So if there are 10 applications in St. Catherine, part of the decision to give a permit must be able for you to be able to determine if you're going to be sufficiently staffed, adequately staffed to monitor that event. If not, you're not going to get away from it.
The emphasis is on the promoter under COVID now. And that is why we put into the new measures that in your promotion of the event, you must promote what is in the measures. So the measures is saying, because when you have an event and you go to the municipal corporation and apply for a permit, they have to go to inspect the venue, so an inspection is done, so you know. So a rising member out of the meeting, the entertainment community is aware of what is needed, and it's not so much the established ones that are the challenge. It is the illegal ones, the ones who are slipping through the back door, the ones who hold the events. Well, yes, because you do have the permit. Okay? But remember, I am saying that I am sure that these measures can work. We will review it to see where we are, and once we are convinced that there is improvement, then we can relax some of the restrictions.
Mr. Semudo.
And I invite you to ask the Minister of Finance to make his presentation deal with the matter standing in his name.
Dr. Clarke. Let me have one.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to give a statement on the repayment of cap debt, the mutual termination of the Alumina sales agreement, and the entry into a marketing agreement. Mr. Speaker, with the support of the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service, the Clarendon Alumina Production Limited, CAP, which is wholly owned by the Government of Jamaica and is a 45% shareholder in the unincorporated Jamaica joint venture, has reached a commercial agreement with its joint venture partner, the Noble Group, as follows. 1. CAP, through a loan from the GOJ, will repay debt obligations due to the Noble Group in the amount of approximately $136.7 million US, the Noble Group loan. The associated security package held by the Noble Group that secures the loan will be released on the repayment of the Noble Group loan. The security package consists of a debenture comprising a fixed and floating charge over CAP's interest in the Jamaica joint venture, a security assignment agreement, and mining rights granted by way of Special Mining Lease 170. CAP and Noble Group will immediately terminate by way of mutual agreement the Alumina sales agreement, which ordinarily terminates in 2025 and under which CAP sold its alumina forward to Noble in 2013, and replace it with a 3-year alumina marketing agreement in respect of CAP's alumina offtake from the Jamaica operation. Under the 3-year marketing agreement, CAP will enjoy the same price for alumina that Noble has secured for itself with respect to its alumina offtake from the Jamaica operation. This has not been the case under the existing alumina sales agreement. In return for the marketing of CAP's alumina at an equivalent price to what it obtains for itself, Noble will be paid a commission of 2% by CAP on the sales price obtained. These transactions, which I refer to as the transactions, represent an important step towards the incorporation and eventual IPO of the Jamaica joint venture. The transactions align the interests of the joint venture partners, who will now, for the first time, enjoy the same fortunes with respect to the Jamaica operations, the same costs and the same revenue, less the aforementioned commission. The Board of CAP and the Cabinet have approved the transactions. By way of background, on the 17th of June 2013, CAP entered into a prepayment facility agreement and an alumina sales agreement with Noble Resources Limited, a company in the Noble Group. Under this arrangement, Noble Resources Limited provided a prepayment financing facility to CAP in the sum of $120 million US for the purpose of repaying amounts previously owed to the joint venture and temporarily bridged by the Petrocarib Development Fund, the National Insurance Fund, and the Development Bank of Jamaica, primarily to pay off CAP's portion of its working capital debt to the Alumina Corporate Company of America, Alcoa, and also to fund further shortfalls that were expected to occur in the medium term until recovery of the alumina market. On or around the 1st of October 2014, the prepayment facility and the alumina sales agreement were novated to Noble Resources International Pte. Limited. Under this 2013 alumina sales agreement, CAP agreed to sell forward the alumina comprising its 45% interest from the Jamaica operations and use the income to offset the amounts advanced by Noble Resources Limited. The price at which CAP's alumina was sold forward to Noble Resources was determined by a formula referring to the London Metal Exchange Index for the aluminium metal. Under this alumina sales agreement, Noble Resources and its affiliates have been and are free to sell the alumina purchased from CAP in the manner on the open market and retain for itself the price differential. It should be noted, Mr. Speaker, for historical accuracy, that the 2013 forward sale agreement does not represent the first time that CAP sold alumina forward. The first forward sale agreement took place over 30 years ago. Furthermore, the 2013 forward sale agreement was an improvement on the forward sale agreement of 2006, which it replaced. However, Mr. Speaker, over the course of the 2013 alumina sales agreement, CAP's proceeds from its share of the alumina offtake have been insufficient, and in many cases grossly insufficient, to meet Jamalco's cash calls. This has exerted significant fiscal pressure on the government of Jamaica, which has had to support CAP with working capital, draining precious resources from the GOJ and impairing CAP's equity value. Over the course of the past 16 years, from the 2005-2006 financial year until the present time, the government of Jamaica has supported CAP in the aggregate amount of over $800 million. Over the past 4 years, net working capital support advanced by the government to CAP, excluding amounts repaid, totaled $64 million, all of which has come in this financial year. In 2017, CAP would have borrowed from the government, but repaid that amount in full last year. The need for working capital support arises as CAP's proceeds from its share of the alumina offtake has been insufficient to meet Jamalco's cash calls. The government of Jamaica does not have any more fiscal space to advance working capital to CAP in this financial year. Instead, therefore, with these transactions, we will be strategically using resources that can be made available for debt repayment to structurally improve the cash flow of CAP by getting better prices for alumina relative to market, thereby reducing the likelihood of new working capital needs that require the government's intervention. I just want to, Mr. Speaker, just mention the benefits of the transactions in the context in which we are operating. The first benefit is that the CAP debt to Noble is a part of Jamaica's national debt stock. The transactions result in a lowering of the national debt by approximately 1% of GDP. The CAP debt to Noble carries an interest rate of 8% per annum and matures in 2025. For financing of similar tenure, the government of Jamaica is now able to borrow at substantially lower rates. For a 5-year duration, we are borrowing at 4.5% or thereabouts. The third, Mr. Speaker, is that the transactions reduce the fiscal risk that CAP poses to the government by immediately improving CAP's cash flows. Fourth, Mr. Speaker, the transactions free security interests pledged to Noble, which provide CAP with greater flexibility going forward. 5, the transactions allow for mutual termination of the alumina sales agreement, whereby CAP sells its alumina forward to Noble, which Noble has been able to resell at a profit over several years, amounting to, given how commodity markets have performed over the course of the alumina sales agreement to date, and with the benefit of hindsight, the alumina sales agreement, Mr. Speaker, has been disadvantageous to Jamaica. These transactions provide an exit from these arrangements. Number 6, with a replacement marketing agreement where CAP obtains the same price that Noble receives for its offtake from the Jamaica refinery, less a 2% commission, CAP is projected to enjoy better prices for its alumina going forward relative to market than has historically been the case. For example, Mr. Speaker, CAP's calculation suggests that had this new marketing agreement been in place over the period 2015 to 2019, CAP would have been better off by approximately $31 million per annum, or 150 million over that period. Number 7, Mr. Speaker, the marketing agreement is of short tenure, 3 years, relative to historical arrangements whereby Jamaica has been locked in for the better part of a decade or longer. It is anticipated that after the incorporation and listing of Jamalco on the Jamaica Stock Exchange, the Jamalco entity will build the technical capacity to market its own alumina. There are Jamaicans working all over the world, in the Middle East, in the Far East, in alumina refineries, who, in an incorporated joint venture, that's a properly structured vehicle with permanent status, would be happy and willing to return and offer their skills to lead this new entity. It is intended by both Noble and CAP and the government of Jamaica that by the time the 3-year marketing agreement ends, the technology transfer will have occurred for Jamalco, in which the government, Noble, and by that time others who are invested to profitably market its own alumina. Number 8, Mr. Speaker, the transactions improve CAP's equity value. And number 9, the transactions pave the way for the incorporation and IPO of Jamalco that are vitally important and essential steps to remove CAP as an enormous fiscal risk to the government of Jamaica and unlock and realize the significant latent value of this GOJ asset. Mr. Speaker, I cannot stress enough how important this is. CAP only ceases to be a fiscal risk to the government of Jamaica once the incorporation and IPO are completed. The government of Jamaica, Mr. Speaker, has no business owning an asset such as this in the form of an unincorporated joint venture. Incorporation, which is now far advanced, is a strategic priority for the government of Jamaica and will continue to require the cooperation and coordination of many ministries, departments, and agencies of government. In the meantime, the transactions described herein reduce the government of Jamaica's debt, structurally improve CAP's cash flows, increases CAP's equity value, and reduces the fiscal risk of CAP to the government of Jamaica. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Golden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm aware that the transactions that the Minister has announced in the House today have been underway for many, many months. It has been an extremely long gestation period, somewhat frustrating at times, but I'm happy that it has reached the point where he's able to make this announcement today. It's interesting to note that he says he cannot stress how important it is that the enormous fiscal risk to the government of Jamaica that CAP represents be unlocked and the value realized, so that essentially CAP ceases to be under the ownership, ultimately, of the government. Of course, it was in the 1980s that CAP was incorporated and that the government exposed itself initially to that fiscal risk by acquiring 50%, it then was, I believe, of the Jamalco refinery through the joint venture, at that time with Alcoa. So, having brought Jamaica into the situation where this risk became a reality, we are now, many, many years later, attempting to go full circle, though we haven't yet achieved that, in the sense that the divestment of CAP, which the Minister has indicated he hopes to take place through the form of an IPO, is not yet a reality, but is the direction in which the government wishes to go. We are pleased that the offtake arrangements for CAP's share of the Jamalco Alumina is going to be fixed now on a a basis that the minister indicates should be a more profitable formula for CAP. At the time when those arrangements were entered into 2013, CAP was very much in the jaws of a lion called Glencore. And they were squeezing Jamaica hard for their own commercial purposes. And indeed, I was instrumental in bringing the Noble Group to Jamaica. And it is a relationship which has paid off well for Jamaica so far, and I'm glad to see that it continues to do so now. Noble advanced funds that enable Jamaica to pay off Glencore. And as part of that arrangement, there was an offtake where the pricing of the alumina was tied to the London Metal Exchange price for aluminium. At this point, with the government owing so much money to Noble, it has enabled, I think, the government's negotiating position to be improved. Noble has wanted certain things to be changed in the relationship, including for the debt owed to them to be paid. And the government, of course, being the one ultimately providing the funding for that payment, has been in a position to renegotiate the offtake arrangement. And as I've said before, we are happy to see that it is the new arrangement is one which they anticipate will result in better prices for CAP. The truth is, owning and operating an alumina refinery is a risky business. We don't produce natural gas or oil in Jamaica. We don't produce caustic. Those are two of the big cost items involved. It has proven necessary for the owners of CAP over time to provide substantial capital, whether we're in the form of working capital or funding for capital expenditures to modernize the plant or undertake major maintenance of the plant. And I can understand the government wants to shift the burden of that to the capital market. And we will see the extent to which that is possible going forward, especially given the difficult times that the country finds itself in now, and with the stock market having lost significant value this year already. Nevertheless, I welcome the minister's announcement. I am glad to see that the debt that we owed, which is part of the public debt, is being paid off. There was a big provision for it in the budget for this year, and the fact that it has been paid off, or it will be paid off, so it hasn't yet happened, but no doubt arrangements have been made to achieve that. As part of an overall restructuring of CAP, is to be welcomed. The incorporation of which the minister speaks, he speaks very highly of it. Speaking for myself, I'm not convinced that it's as significant as he makes out. Whether the partners in the business are in the form of a joint venture through a partnership or through forming a company to hold their investment, at the end of the day, if the business is failing, they have to make a decision whether to put further money into it or not. And that's a decision which, over many years, the owners of CAP have felt compelled to respond to by funding whatever losses or additional capital needs the entity may have had. I look forward to the next step in this transaction and hopefully a successful IPO if the market conditions turn around. And I don't know whether the minister intends to fully divest the government's position in CAP or a portion of it. He hasn't yet said so. If he can shed any light on that, it would be interesting to know. But he can rest assured that as long as the transaction is done in a way which is in the best interests of the capital market of Jamaica and indeed taxpayers, it will have our support. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Paulwell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Just a few questions. My colleague having dealt with the matter substantially. In